Welcome to Rune Soup, a podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal, coming to you from Land Down Under. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. Enjoy. Today on Rune Soup, we welcome Dr. Aaron Cheak, comparative religious scholar, author, editor, and all-around expert in the fields of alchemy and Hermeticism. Dr. Aaron, thank you for your time.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, traditional first question, Aaron, were you a weird kid?
Yeah, I kind of just think I'm normal, but in hindsight and by comparison, I guess I have to answer yes, I was a weird kid. I don't know. I was always drawn to kind of strange and obscure things, and I don't really remember too much of my early childhood, but I just remember I have stories that my parents and family tell me, which are kind of strange. Like they had to get rid of the family dog because I was just imitating it and basically acting like a dog to it was almost going wild and stuff. Of course, I don't remember any of this. This is just hearsay. But, I would allegedly bring home sheep's skulls and, spinal columns of animals I'd find and stuff back in Auckland when I was a kid.
Well, you're the second Kiwi I've had on the show who seems to have brought bones home as a kid. I wonder if that was just a pastime you guys were interested in.
Yeah, maybe it's just, a native pastime. So I'd have to say yes, in general.
And then we were talking about this before the show. You were born in Auckland, but you moved around 13?
Yeah, I was around 12 or 13, I think. My parents moved to Australia, the Gold Coast, of all places. And... so I've been here in Australia for an entire Saturn cycle, like 28 years, and I'm kind of feeling I've done my time here, and I'm feeling the call to move on back to where I came from, back to New Zealand.
And tell me a bit more about that call. What are you specifically talking about there? The main thing is, the entire time I've been in Australia, and don't get me wrong, Australia is a beautiful country in many ways, but I never felt that earth connection, that that sense that I could put my roots down here and be content. So I went back to Auckland very briefly last year, and I just really felt that sense of connection to the land, which is something I've been missing for most of my life. I just that call hit me very strongly, and I realized I have to kind of follow that call and go back. Had you been to New Zealand fairly often in between moving from around the age of 12, 13 and when you went back last year?
No, only a couple of times, and it was usually for funerals of family members and things like that. So. Yeah, there was a couple of brief trips, but generally speaking, it's been very few and far between.
So if you're going back for funerals, it might have kind of messed with the signal about the feeling that land connection, or is that something that you think you now probably have the intellectual skills to kind of model in your head about what it is you're feeling, given the sort of trajectory your academic career has gone on? Yeah,
in a way, because. Growing up in Australia, I never really feeling at home here. I became essentially a Europhile and longed to move to, France or Germany or some, Eastern Europe or somewhere obscure, relatively speaking. And I realized over time that was kind of a diversion or of that sense of calling for where I actually came from, because, as people often say, New Zealand is kind of like Middle Earth. It is this archetypal, it's got this archetypal European
mythic kind of layer of history to it. Well, not history, but that sort of archetypal sensibility.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we were talking before the show. I lived there for 6 years. It's like a half dimension away version of Europe. It has the sort of angles of the mountains are slightly different, but there's something about it that seems eternally familiar in the way myth works. And I think that's about 40% of the success of the Lord of the Rings films, is that people look at this landscape and go, I've never been there and I fucking know this place.
Yeah. And I think I'd displaced that longing onto Europe for such a long time. So when I went through university, I was really wanting to be. I was kind of a frustrated Indo-Europeanist. I wanted to learn Indo-European studies, and they didn't really teach that anymore because it had been kind of, I don't know. It's a academic tradition that is very old school.
It's politically fraught in the 21st century.
Yeah, there's that as well. And so I kind of cobbled together my own version of Indo-European studies because I couldn't do it directly. So I studied linguistics, and I studied all the components of Indo-European studies. So it was linguistics. I did Sanskrit, and I studied German, and did religious studies, comparative religion. So because really comparative religion grew out of from Max Muller, grew out of this comparative study of Indo-European languages. When they started comparing these languages, they started realizing this fundamental similarity, as if they were from a common root. And then they started doing the same thing with religious studies and comparative mythology, and looking at the morphology of different myths and legend, myths and folklores, and traditional religious texts and so forth.
So would you say, I mean, let's pick the story back up when you just moved to the Gold Coast, which, I went there for schoolies, decidedly unmagical place, however fun it is. Did the magic emerge out of the Europhilia? I mean, where did the interest in esotericism, at least as a sort of topic of history, come from?
Yeah, well, I guess by the time I was in my, mid to late teens, I guess it does speak to that calling of not feeling at home where I was and feeling drawn elsewhere. And I guess from about that age, I started being drawn to foreign and strange things. And often they were more from European culture rather than, say, contemporary Australian culture or kind of pop US kind of culture. I would watch the old silent German horror films, for instance, Nosferatu and Der Golem and all these kind of things like that. And anything, untoward, unusual, foreign, strange, extreme, anything like that I could get my hands on, I would just devour. So, and I guess that led me to, at first it was more on an aesthetic level, and eventually a more intellectual and philosophical level emerged out of that affinity.
Right, so it's interesting. I mean, I think there's a classic Antipodean quest there. It is a quest for authenticity when you're in a place that seems where you're either displaced or you seem culturally to have very shallow roots. That was certainly, that describes up and down my own experience. And interesting that you mentioned those films. Nosferatu is still one of my favorite films, and because it is beautiful, and it was a foreign visual language that had an authenticity that I wasn't necessarily seeing on Hey, It's Saturday.
Oh yeah, just a slight contrast there.
Yeah, a little bit. So is that it for you? I mean, if you were interested in that kind of weird and spooky stuff, did you kind of daisy chain along from, I have an aesthetic interest in this, and there are aspects of esotericism that are in these films, and then, oh wait, this stuff is actually is a real thing and not just a device in kind of European visual language. Is that generally, would that describe the process through the teens, or did you just decide at one point, like, no, I'm going to go, I'm just going to go balls out studying Hermeticism and so on?
Yeah, well, it was kind of like, no, I mean, it was I called the process affinity. So, and the starting point that draws you in is in a strange way related to where you end up. But often, if you look at that entry point and the end point, or at least where you are now, they can look quite different. But I kind of find it's like this. You're slowly walking down a path, and you know the path from the beginning, or you like the path, but you don't necessarily know where that path is going to take you. You might think it's going to take you a certain direction or a certain place, but it ends up unfolding in very naturally, but in ways that you wouldn't suspect. So it was kind of like that. So I started out with this interest in, old foreign horror films and things like that, and eventually, at some point, I guess the main transition for me was Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible, of all things, and that turned me onto a more, I hesitate to say intellectual or philosophical orientation based on LaVey's work, but it was a starting point. It sort of opened me up to a different world, and then of course one thing leads to another, and yeah.
He's definitely a gateway. That book was readily available. I mean, I'm from regional Australia, so I know what you mean. It's kind of easy to get your hands on that. And oddly enough, this is the second conversation I've had about Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible today, having not thought about it or mentioned it in at least this year. I find that kind of interesting. I was talking to a former guest today, and yeah, so how interesting. It came up twice. But that and obviously the Simonomicon were sort of easier to get in a pre-internet world, and my experience of it was kind of the same. It was exciting to first read, and then you suddenly realize there's probably a lot more to this, and it becomes a gateway, an intellectual gateway drug into, like, well, this Enochian business, or whatever it happens to be, whatever piece of it, let's pull on that thread. Or at least that was my journey. Does that describe something similar for you?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I like the idea of the gateway drug, Satanism leads to Hermeticism. Be careful.
Yeah, I can see the public service announcements now.
But no, there is this sort of more sinister side of things. That was much more pronounced in my interest for that stuff at an earlier age, and so I just explored what I had access to, and things like LaVey eventually led me to the Temple of Set and their reading list, the reading list of the Temple of Set, which really kind of opened my world up back in the early 1990s. This is before, I don't want to say it's before the internet, but it's certainly before I had the internet. When you're kind of using your minimal resources to kind of make your way through these strange worlds. I eventually. When I actually did get to Europe, oddly enough, the very first thing I did when I arrived in Germany, and after a couple of train rides from Frankfurt, I arrived in Berlin, and the very first thing was that I got pulled into was this week-long initiatory retreat with Nicholas and Zena Schreck. So it's odd that there's these kind of affinities, which on one hand drew me to Europe, and on the other hand drew me to Satanism, and or at least the sinister current and initiation. Kind of both came to a head in that kind of one moment in Berlin. I got to spend a week in a kind of initiatory retreat with no kind of external communication means with Nicholas and Zena, and that was that was a very transformative experience.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting you keep using the word affinity, and it's almost a you essentially Celia Pacino'd your way into it by kind of pulling together these things that have a similar signature. So you accidentally ritualized your appearance in Berlin for a week-long initiatory ritual.
Yeah, yeah. I like how you describe it as Celia Pacinoizing it, because this idea of affinity is very much. I mean, I'm taking it from. I mean, Schwaller de Lubitsch uses the term affinity, but yeah, it is very much coming from that that same sensibility that Pacino uses of following that 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 kind of harmony, that hidden harmony that's in your being, which resonates with deeper things, which you're not quite aware of yet, but which, if you allow yourself to follow them, then they kind of really bring you to places you wouldn't have suspected.
Yes, it's a less annoying way of saying like attracts like. It has a bit more intellectual depth to it and a bit more movement and agency within it.
Definitely, definitely.
So after that, I mean, was that enough for you to go, all right, from a higher educational perspective, I'm going to double down on this specific part of Western esotericism?
Well, yeah, when I got to Europe, that was in 2005, and I was technically there on my PhD research, quote unquote research, but really it was just my excuse to be in Europe, and but the main things I was researching at the time were actually my thesis was, it started out being this sprawling beast, which was trying to tackle the question of apotheosis in a world where God is dead, which that was my original thesis topic, and it's sort of the idea of apotheosis, immortalization, deification. In what does that mean in this kind of post-Nietzschean predicament that we're in? And the two approaches I wanted to use to explore that was the work of Schwaller de Lubitsch, and in particular his work on the fixed salt in its role in immortality, and the work of John Gebser, the German cultural philosopher. And both Schwaller and Gebser hinge a lot on the question of consciousness. So I was bringing that whole question in to explore that issue.
That is a beast, Aaron. That is that's not a PhD. That's a 5-century quest.
Yeah, it is. And they tell you, choose a narrow topic. Don't be overambitious. And I'm like, I'll be right. I can handle this. I've got it. But no, you'd learn the hard way. So I basically had to. I hit a crisis point where my department realized they'd given me a long leash, because I kind of knew I was a scholar who could handle myself on my own, and I didn't need too much babysitting in terms of the quality of my work. So they gave me a kind of a long leash, and I think when they kind of pulled me back in, they might have regretted it a little bit. And so I had a bit of a crisis with my department and realized, okay, no, this is just too big of a project. And it was certainly beyond the bounds of what really an academic religious studies department could really hope to contain. So I ended up going, okay, what I've got, most of the material I have at this point is on the life and alchemy of René Schwaller de Lubitsch. So I ended up going, okay, that's material I can take. There's a thesis worth of material just there. So I ended up reconfiguring my PhD around around the topic of Schwaller and alchemy, and I just had to put aside the other material until I'd finished that. And yes.
Okay, well, let's wind that back then, because I didn't realize that's how the timelines went. Tell us, I mean, how did you first encounter Schwaller de Lubitsch, and then tell us a bit about who he was.
Okay. Well, again, this goes back to my, quasi-satanic days, my, affinity for sinister initiation. As I mentioned, I was drawn to the Temple of Set, which for me at the time was a more
it seemed like a more sophisticated philosophical expression of what initially drew me through the works of the works of LaVey and so forth. But the Temple of Set had this fantastic reading list, and it was really through the Temple of Set's reading list that I was exposed to a lot of things, actually, as you know, in my wayward youth that I'm still exploring to this day. The main things being, the work of Schwaller de Lubitsch. So they had probably most of Schwaller's works on the reading list, and also in particular they had the work of the memoir by Andre Vandenberg called Alchemy, which is this fascinating memoir of the last years of Schwaller's life. Anyway, just to backtrack and give you some idea of who Schwaller is. Schwaller de Lubitsch was a French Hermetic philosopher from he was active in the early to mid 20th century. He was roughly contemporary with, say, a figure like Carl Jung. He's most well known as an Egyptologist. His major works, and certainly the works that have been translated into English, are all works on symbolist Egyptology. And he's really the kind of bedrock behind figures like John Anthony West and Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock, who explored this alternative view of history in Egyptology. But Schwaller's work is much wider than really an alternative chronology. He, as I said, he was a Hermetic philosopher, and he was in the 1910s to 1920s. He was closely involved with a figure by the name of Fulcanelli, who was one of France's most enigmatic and probably famous modern alchemists. And Schwaller worked with Fulcanelli on works, actually laboratory alchemical works, an opus trying to achieve, an alchemical stained glass, which was understood to reproduce the kind of stained glass that the earliest Gothic cathedrals had, because Fulcanelli's most known for his work on the mystery of the cathedrals, where he interprets the Gothic cathedrals, especially Notre Dame and Chartres, as alchemical texts in stone. And so he did this elaborate Hermetic alchemical reading of the symbolism of these cathedrals. And so what Schwaller did when he went to Egypt, he kind of did the same thing with the Temple of Luxor, the Temple of Amun at Luxor. He undertook this essentially Hermetic symbolic reading of this Egyptian temple. So
I want to jump in there because Schwaller de Lubitsch did literal and figurative spade work when it came to having presenting his own interpretation of the temple and its sort of psycho-spiritual function. He actually went to Egypt. He actually measured stuff out. He was there not just necessarily speculating from books. And in that respect, he's very difficult to read, I would say. It's interesting you mentioned Alchemy. When people ask me about it, my suggestion is read Alchemy, quickly read John Anthony West's Serpent in the Sky, just so you kind of have quickly read it, and then you should have enough kind of beginning pieces to then attempt Schwaller himself, because he was not fucking around with his stuff. Like, he went there and he did the measurements, and he came out with some astounding information.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's good that you point that out, because he was there for 15 years. It's kind of. I kind of sometimes dream of living a lifestyle like that. They set themselves up in a wing of the Winter Palace at Luxor. It was the former residence of the Egyptian royal family. They took up a whole hotel wing for 15 years and just ensconced themselves there in order to study these temples in depth. They did their own measurements. They had their own entourage of collaborators, some of them actual Egyptologists, and it's really the scale of their work is hard to fathom when you compare the work of, say, more modern esotericists, for instance. And what's interesting, because there's this contention with Schwaller and vis-a-vis conventional Egyptology, which is something that has been perpetuated in the work of the symbolist Egyptologists like John Anthony West, But this whole confrontation happened between Schwaller and French academics, French academic Egyptological circles back on Egyptian soil in the 1940s and 1950s. But what's interesting is that Schwaller and his stepdaughter Lucy Lamy did all these, as you say, precise measurements. But for a long time, because they did such a good job, all the illustrations they used and the measurements and the representations of the temple that they published were used by legitimate Egyptologists for decades to come as their standard reference point when they were writing an academic article, for instance, and they needed to refer to this pylon from Luxor Temple or this this relief or something.
Yeah, I want to jump in there because I think you're absolutely correct. I'm about to ask you for a definition of the symbolist interpretation of Egyptian history in a minute, because there is a false dichotomy in quote-unquote alternative archaeology today, which is Egyptology today, which is there to, being very cynical, I mean, I have affection for these people, but it's there to sell books and tours of Egypt. So... Right. For instance, John Anthony West, bless him, does very good tours of Egypt, but when people ask him about the esoteric components, because he's, very pro Schwaller, and I think that's fine and admirable, but when they ask him about the esoteric components, he does tend to skirt around it because... quite frankly, you sell less tickets to Egypt if you're going to be talking about that kind of thing, and it is their core business. But if you go back to, for me, the heyday of Egyptology was the essentially first half of the 20th century, when you had well-funded Polish, German, Italian, French, and British groups who were there doing actual spade work, but also there was a difference in. They could argue about the interpretations, but the data underlying it would be interchangeable. So you could use Schwaller provided precise measurements, so you can use it. And symbolism was a, dare I say, legitimate interpretation of the sort of archaeological evidence that was available at the time. And I think people miss that. We have this idea that Egyptology, as presented by the lunatic in the hat when you see him on National Geographic, that has always been the story. It's not at all the case. It has been the data were a source of intense and rigorous intellectual debate, and symbolism, or the symbolist interpretation, was a big part of that. So that's just a rant I wanted to get out there, because we we landed on something I liked. I'm not sure if you want to agree or disagree or add to that before you give us what the symbolist interpretation actually is.
Yeah, no, I do agree. There needs to be a nuanced middle ground between those extremes, which is interesting because I'm actually working with the people right now who did a series called Magical Egypt. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it.
I am indeed.
Right, so they're in the process of doing a new series of Magical Egypt, and I sort of got I don't know. They contacted me, and I came up and met them, and just to do an interview or something, and I got along really well with them. They're really cool people. I'm actually doing this interview from their house. It's on the Sunshine Coast. It's a really great spot. But anyway, so what I've been working with them, and more I've been sort of drawn into this project, and then doing exactly what kind of you just said. Okay, how do we strike this middle ground where we're not polarizing, this narrative of quackademics, or as John Anthony West would say, versus symbolists, and how can we strike this middle ground, which is treads a bit more carefully in approaching all of these issues. So that's one thing I'm literally right in the middle of working on right now. So it's quite fascinating. But yeah, there's this symbolist approach, really. It's probably better if I talk about Schwaller's idea of symbolique, because that's a profound concept, and that really elucidates a lot of his work before Egypt and also during and after Egypt. For him, symbolique was it really was a application of the Hermetic theory of sulfur, mercury, and salt, in the sense that he understood it. And what I mean by that is that he would see all of reality as an interaction of these three principles. And so for Schwaller, sulfur was this paternal principle which gave form or a seed or a pattern, which it imposed upon a mercurial principle, which was regarded as feminine and material, or I would even go so far as to say proto-material. So before matter takes form as such, it's in this proto-material state. So when you get this interaction of these two principles, sulfur and mercury, or form and formlessness, they congeal to create a salt. And that salt is the formed thing. Okay, so it's got form and it's got matter. So this goes back to Platonic theories as well. And so you've got these, I guess, formative forces versus formed things. And for Schwaller, symbolique was an understanding of that process by which the forms or patterns from a divine origin can be read through the medium of their material incarnation. So the symbolist approach to anything, or this, in Schwaller's sense at least, partakes of a desire to understand anything in terms of its formative forces as well as its material embodiment. Whereas Schwaller would himself say that ordinary science versus or as compared to sacred science only studies the materialized object. If that makes sense.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So when he was looking at Schwaller's interpretation at a macro level of, say, Luxor, was that the Egyptians were very interested in. Well, a core of ancient Egyptian esotericism was a fascination with the symbolic nature of the cosmos itself, so that a wall is not just a wall; it is deliberately in the length that it is and the ratio as it is, because they were expressing their understanding of this concept.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, really, it's a doctrine of correspondences, and that with the sense that the chain of being acts through all phenomenal things, and so for Schwaller, when he would, he says even the choice of stone that the Egyptians would use for this or that, this or that piece of architecture or this or that statue was chosen with that sort of mentality in mind. So if it's a sedimentary rock and it's got like a flowing pattern in it from its aqueous origin, that was chosen for those symbolic purposes because it has it's got this aquatic or watery signature to it, which in turn comes from a related divine principle and so forth. So it's really a way of seeing divine principles acting through the material world and embodied in the material world.
And this was at the core of most of the sort of dynastic periods building projects, because the sedimentary one's a very good example. You also have the use of alabaster, which I think is it's a reasonable assumption to consider that some sort of expression of divine milk.
Yes.
So, and funnily enough, this is sort of in my book, and it's why we're kind of heading there before we head into Hermeticism. it's very difficult to argue otherwise, because if you look at where the Egyptians sourced their stone from, particularly in the sort of probably the peak of, the two peaks of this idea, it wasn't like anything that was to hand. They weren't even getting it from inside Egypt. And in some cases, these stones are coming from outside Africa. So they're really making it difficult for themselves. If there is no meaning behind it, they're insane. And the sort of counter argument, if you can call it that, to whether Schwaller was correct in his assignation of, well, this stone could mean this and this stone could mean that, is beside the point. That's an endless and fascinating argument. But the sort of alternative response is, oh no, they didn't. They go, well, that's not really that's not really an argument position to take if they're pulling stones from way up the Nile, if they're pulling stones from modern day Lebanon, or where modern day Lebanon is now. If they're actually constructing it, there has to be a philosophical ideology behind it that appears to be there from the beginning of the kind of dynastic era.
Yes, definitely. And that's the thing. I mean, the idea of the temple as a didactic edifice, a construction that was meant to teach or convey knowledge and wisdom. This is something that was an assumption behind the interpretation of the Gothic cathedrals, but also it really. I mean, and when Schwaller does this with the Egyptian temples, he's in a very real sense, he's tracing the origins of the Hermetic tradition to its foundational roots.
Absolutely. And what I find fascinating about him and Falconelli is that they traced it out of sequence, if that makes sense, because their work was based on, at the time, an assumption that I would say this sort of intervening 70 years of an improved chronology of Egypt and an improved kind of archaeological understanding of the world has kind of borne them out. But that idea that they started with, it kind of forms much, much later. You're sort of talking in the sort of 1200s rather than Egypt. And it's really interesting that we're seeing it come through out of sequence now. When I was doing the research for the book, there was a growing number of articles in sort of quote-unquote legitimate Egyptological journals about the alchemical idiom in the pyramid texts and all this kind of stuff. So they were going at it from a full-blown early 20th century esotericist point of view, but the intervening decades have kind of shown that even if that interpretation came from later European documents, that information ended up in those later European documents because they were there originally in Egypt.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. It's I'm always hesitating to when people say things like the various esoteric orders try to trace their lineage and their origins to Egypt. I'm always kind of suspicious and kind of very hesitant to kind of accept that line of thinking. But there is certainly a level where you can trace Egyptian influences and ideas through the channels of Pythagoreanism and certainly aspects of Greek philosophy, the theurgic traditions.
Absolutely. I wouldn't
right through into the Platonic and Neoplatonic traditions, Ficino, as we mentioned, and there is a current which, at least in an intellectual historical sense, does come through.
Yes, it's certainly not an unbroken chain of sort of mouth-to-ear transmission of sacred knowledge. This stuff vanished for a millennia from most of Europe, and it was cobbled together and in a process that took centuries and was quite wrong for a lot of that time, from, as you say, recovered Greek texts, things that had been translated out of Arabic from Moorish Spain coming back into Europe. So it kind of solve et coagulate.
I think you might have just broken up a bit in the end there. So
fair enough. I'm saying it basically dissolved and reformed in a way that I found quite interesting. It wasn't necessarily an unbroken line. But I want to jump back to the stones and their meaning and what that implies for Hermeticism. So we'll start with, because this is obviously a very easy question, we'll start with what is Hermeticism, and how does that relate to deliberate choice of stone in the dynastic building projects of Egypt?
Right. It's, whenever someone asks me what is alchemy or what is Hermeticism, I should be able to give you a direct answer, but I always find myself struggling because I'm often kind of redefining it continually myself. But certainly, for me at least, when I talk about Hermeticism, I'm talking about traditions which in their origin came out of the Egyptian temple cult and the priestly art, the hieratic arts of the Egyptian temples. And because Thoth, who was associated later with Hermes and Mercury, was associated with sacred writing, the hieroglyphs, and those whole traditions, he was very closely connected with the formation, but also the transmission of those traditions. And in particular, what I find interesting is how in late antiquity, when you're getting the whole, when the Egyptian temples are declining, you get this sense of a current of transmission of Egyptian knowledge, which is cast into the Hellenized world via a kind of translation process, and the Greek word for translator was a hermeneus, and based on the word Hermes, which and hermeneus meant a translator or interpreter. But what they were doing was, when they were taking Egyptian traditions and translating them into a Greek idiom, they weren't translating a text literally word by word or sentence by sentence from Egyptian to Greek. They were taking Egyptian traditions, cosmological and theological traditions, and kind of casting them in the language of Greek mythology and cosmology and theology. So it was how would we make sense of this in a Hellenistic context? And they would translate it into the kind of the Hellenistic worldview rather than word by word. So there's this translation process going on, which the figure of Hermes is also very much closely bound to. And the origins of Hermeticism, the Corpus Hermeticum as we know it, this collection of Greek texts and a Latin tractate, are very much emerge out of that, as does arguably the Gnostic corpus and the Greek magical papyri and other texts. Even the Greek alchemical corpus as well. So there's these texts that seem to emerge around that time, which I think can be arguably grounded in this sort of general process of translation from Egyptian to Greek.
And for people who aren't aware, the Alexander's general who went on to found Alexandria did so with a very specific mission to cohere the world's knowledge in this new empire. So this wasn't just something people were doing. This was not exclusively a movement of Egyptian ideas into Greek. This was a mission. This is what they were doing around the world. So it's not around the classical world of Alexander's empire. So it wasn't actually it doesn't sound as odd when you realize that was kind of what people were doing. They're like, okay, let's cohere the world's information and in a way, as you say, moving the ideas into the language that people were speaking. And there was this sort of grand intellectual hope or project that the world's knowledge could kind of improve in Alexandria, which it did subsequently become, could be this sort of home of that. So when you mention the Gnostic texts and you mention the Greek magical papyri and the sort of emergence of astrology as we would recognize it, this is all happening around the same time because it's all part of this project of coherence of knowledge.
Yeah, definitely. And most of these traditions, very frequently attribute the origin, their origin to Hermes, which is which comes up in the alchemical text, in the Greek alchemical texts, the Hellenistic astrology texts. Even in Iamblichus and Iamblichian theurgy, he traces this to Hermes and Egyptian origins. And it starts to just, some scholars have dismissed that as just like a general conceit that they had. But no, more and more, if you bring out those contexts, like you say, it starts falling into place and becoming very much more solid, I think.
Well, a hit job was taken out on Hermeticism a few centuries ago. If you look at it's the reemergence. I mean, this is for the listeners, but if you look at the reemergence of the Corpus Hermeticum during the Renaissance and to some extent triggering the Renaissance, their ideas about it being that original eternal wisdom were carried on for a couple of centuries, and then you had Casaubon realizing, and correctly, that the use of Greek in it indicates that it is not actually that old, and he kind of dated some of it reasonably accurately. But as a result, Hermeticism kind of fell by the wayside for a couple of centuries after Casaubon as this, classical Greek fakery in many respects. And that turned out to not necessarily be the case. At the time, again, we couldn't read hieroglyphs, so we lacked the depth of information to kind of match what is in what we now call the Hermetic text, which is obviously a very elastic term. We lacked the context to kind of match what's in those texts with what we do, in fact, know about dynastic Egypt. And in the last 100 or so years, certainly post-Rosetta Stone, but in the last 100 or so years, as we start to understand more and more pieces look like they were telling it accurately when they said this is, a survival of ancient Egyptian wisdom into the classical world. It's just that it was written in what was at the time modern Greek.
Definitely. I mean, and that's the thing with, manuscript traditions. I mean, that the actual time that this manuscript may have been written is never always a good indication of the provenance of the ideas. So definitely, yeah, I mean, it was a late Greek text, the Corpus Hermeticum, but, Iamblichus himself said, in late antiquity that these ideas go back to, trace back to the Egyptian temples and the Egyptian priests.
Yeah, I think they all knew it, and that's what I find so satisfying about it now in the sort of opening years of the 21st century, that it gives us an opportunity to restore accuracy to some of the things the likes of Iamblichus was saying, but that gives us a further opportunity to kind of go, well, if we thought they were wrong about that for centuries and they're not, and it invites us to look again at some of the other things they were saying. As an example of the information that we've kind of got, that I think has sort of further plugged Hermeticism back into Egypt. Tell us about the technical Hermetica and how maybe that matches things like the use of stone that we see during the dynastic building projects.
Right. So, and I guess this is a good way for me to get back to giving you at least a substantial definition of Hermeticism. Because one of the things, I think theurgy is like a very important key to this, because a lot of the you've talked about this sort of, scholarship from the last 100 years coming along and kind of giving us a more accurate view of or at least kind of reorienting things from this like hitman job that they've undergone. But scholarship of theurgy, especially over the last 30 years or so, and particularly the work of Gregory Shaw, has really drawn out how these traditions of essentially like ceremonial magical invocation of gods and embodiment of divine forces were closely bound with philosophy and essentially magical practices, and it borders very closely on alchemy, and there's certainly an astrological, cosmological dimension to this as well. So, what you start to see is that all of these things
were never meant to be separate. So philosophy, theology, magic, alchemy, astrology, all of these things were different facets of one whole. And the work of Gregory Shaw in particular is great because he keeps... Peter Kingsley has done this as well. A number of scholars have really kind of driven this point home that, like, when we think of a philosopher, we have this kind of very modern idea of a dry, rational, academic approach to reality, which is kind of long-winded and, deadeningly boring. But in the ancient world, at least, among these kinds of philosophers, it's a very rich world. And Peter Kingsley traces it back to figures like Parmenides and Empedocles. When he talks about the so-called father of philosophy, Parmenides, and he says, what did Parmenides do? You could imagine Parmenides writing maybe a philosophical exegesis of some kind, something. But what did he do? He wrote a poem. And what was his poem about? It was about a descent into the underworld to meet a goddess, So at the root of philosophy is these essentially mystery traditions, and you don't have to go too far before you're into the world of magic and theology and alchemy and all these kinds of things. So, I guess, as a definition of Hermeticism, it is a philosophical tradition which has this kind of integral character, this all-embracing character.
It also has, and this is in some of your work, and we'll get you to talk around this, it strongly indicates that, and this is, let me start with one of the things Dr. Skinner found when he completed his PhD, which is now 2 excellent books, Techniques of Greco-Egyptian Magic and Techniques of Solomonic Magic. In the entire PGM, there aren't any love spells, which is surprising, because that tends to be the most common spell. And the suggestion, and I think he's correct in this, is that we found this in the Middle Ages as well. When you have too many priests, when there are too many priests for churches, they tend to practice their priestcraft for money. So there are people who are charged with doing things like conducting requiem masses for people who are still alive, because there are these priests with their parishes who had all these skills and couldn't do anything. And as we see the emergence of the late period, I think there's a very good case to be made that a lot of particular technical hermetica and the practice of magic are essentially out of work priests in many respects. Now, could you talk about that in relation to the technical hermetica and, say, for instance, the very classic hermetic concept of drawing an intelligence or a spirit into a talisman or a statue? Yeah, no,
I do tend to agree with what you just said. I mean, you had this disenfranchisement of the Egyptian temple culture in that period, and these highly skilled priests, who were immersed in these hieratic traditions, these hieratic arts, had to find a means to, use their skills and gain a livelihood.
I want to talk about how the Hermetic concept of drawing spirits down is a survival from the Egyptian temple practices, and I think that's fairly open and shut.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, one of the things I find most fascinating in this, I always come back to this sort of motif of statue animation because so many things hinge upon it. It goes back to the Egyptian mouth opening ritual, which was a rite for statue animation, a rite for reviving the dead, and animating statues. It was drawing the spirit or the god into this material form, and these kind of practices unfold and feed out into the texts that we have in the Corpus Hermeticum, the Greek magical papyri, also the alchemical corpus, and they can all be traced back to some degree to a kind of correlation to the mouth opening ritual, and it's really, for me, it's a sense that it's about the principle of embodiment. It really pivots on embodiment, because certainly in the Greek alchemical corpus, they say you cannot achieve anything unless you know how to corporealize spirits or spiritualize bodies. So there's a sense of fluidity between the corporeal world or the corporeal form and the spiritual entities. And then you can trace this idea really right down to the Emerald Tablet, where they say that which is above is like that which is below, and vice versa. So there's a sense of these two worlds, the spiritual world and the embodied world, as having mediating realms which can be, used to kind of have a more fluid interaction between these states. But what's interesting is that it gets right to the logic of theurgy and these traditions. You get right down to Celia Pacino, where the nature of the substance is relevant. It's not random. So when you're choosing a stone for a statue, just as when you're choosing a substance for a talisman, you do not choose just any random thing lying around at hand. The nature of that substance is sympathetic to the divinity which you are calling into it. And this goes back to what I said before about this sulfur, mercury, salt idea, this idea that there's a spiritual pattern or principle which can embody and mold in a certain way a material form into its manifest state. And it presupposes that there was this chain of being. That there was a system of lineages, which involves. Which also comes through in the astrological world. So each of the planetary divinities had lineages of their chain of being from the celestial world down through to the material world. Most famously, the sun is connected with gold, and the rooster, and the sunflower, and so on. And the moon also had its own lineage or chain of being, and as did all the other planets. So when you look at the phenomenal world, you are starting to see, from that perspective, you start to see these divine lineages working and weaving through material reality. And so when you want to work with a divine form, you choose its extensions in this world to interact with it. And one of the things that So this, if you understand the process of making a divine statue in this way, it starts to become clearer what they're doing.
Yes, so in the magical texts we have, be they astrological or the PGM or technical Hermetica and so on, what you're saying we're looking at, and I think it's a very good position, is that we essentially have a transliterated survival of the symbolic language that the priests were trained and thought in, that which was the thing that Schwaller was picking up on when he was doing his work in Egypt, because that was where I was going with the deliberate use of stone, where appears to be its echo is found in the technical Hermetica, where a certain stone is meant to be this, and this plant is associated with this, and it does begin to paint that picture of
that knowledge of correspondences, essentially having a deeper origin than, say, the late antique Hermetica or
and that it's not all exclusively Babylonian. That in fact, I mean, I'm an Egyptophile, so I would go 60-40 in Egypt's case for a lot of the Hermetic stuff.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, definitely. Yeah.
So, I mean, let me paint a picture, because I think this is going to help for people. If you consider the role of a priest in towards the end of the New Kingdom, so 18th on, they're essentially zookeepers. Their jobs are to zookeep a statue or statues that have a living thing in them. They were spoken to, they were woken up, they were put to bed at night, they were perambulated around, and people weren't to look at them. This was a very, very... This was kind of the peak of this concept of drawing down into material bases that were chosen for very specific reasons. And then as the culture goes into decline, and this is Dr. Skinner's point, the reason he suspects, and he's probably correct, that there are no love spells in the PGM is that these are priests. They didn't, they were celibate. So they're out there doing everything else, but they're not out there trying to get into some Egyptian farm woman's pants because they're not allowed to. And so we have these. It's kind of what's happening to the academy with the sort of draining of money as water from a bath. That you have all these people who are like, well, I have these fucking skills to turn a statue into a living thing. Now that is genuinely potentially useful to people, because if you do have a problem with a neighbor, or if there are issues with crops, or whatever it happens to be, there are gods and spirits that can help you with it, and what you need is someone to bring that down into a form that you can feed and engage with, and just to be kind of base in the description of it. But we have all these pieces of history suggesting that there was the cultural impact of out-of-work priests in that sense is expressed, and it says something I think very exciting about Hermeticism, because it's close enough. This is my whole thing, right? So it's close enough. Classical Alexandria at its peak is close enough to us that we understand them. They ate very similar foods. They had similar opinions of politics and so on. They're not so far removed from us that we can't develop a sense of their personality, which means there are these ideas. Whereas Old Kingdom Egyptians, very difficult to get in their heads. However, their concepts are there in a form that is bioavailable to us in these Hermetic texts, and there's an opportunity to kind of experience the mouthfeel of that kind of 5,000-year Egyptian project, admittedly jumbled up and in a 60-40 split, and I think the most profound pieces of it is that the technical Hermetica and the drawing down of spirits into talismans and objects is this echo of Egyptian priesthood, and I find that very beautiful, frankly.
Yeah, no, it definitely is a continuation of the priestly art, and one of the things that happens is, and this, people like Jonathan Z. Smith have looked at this, and other scholars of the Greek magical papyri have explored it. In particular, how you have this process of statue animation or statue creation, fashioning statues and animating them, and so they're vehicles for divinity, which you can interact with here on Earth. This whole process became miniaturized when these disenfranchised priests build into the Hellenistic world. They had to miniaturize that temple cult and these sort of ritual processes. So instead of making statues, they'd make a ring or a talisman or something much more mobile. And the whole apparatus of ritual magic, they didn't have a temple and the whole infrastructure. They had to scale it down for a much more practical use. And that's definitely something we can really relate to, I suppose, as people trying to pick up these traditions. We don't have a whole temple infrastructure anymore devoted to the obscure god that we happen to be drawn to. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And the what I think people would be very excited about listening to this, as they are generally magical practitioners, is that those pieces are highly conserved through time, so that the practice of summoning a spirit or attracting the attention of a god is highly conserved, and it's about 80% similar to what you see in Alexandria today. And the pieces in Alexandria are this miniaturization of, essentially packing up and making portable the temple cult.
Definitely. And so, you get the famous Gnostic rings, for example, but there's a bunch of these rings, or essentially stones, with a god, form carved on it, and it's a specific kind of stone, So, and it's very common, and scholars who have looked at this have usually realized that, well, most of the examples of, say, Venus carved on these small stones are on lapis lazuli, and which is in the text of that period is considered a sympathetic stone to Venus, and so on and so forth. Even in the Greek magical papyri, there is an example of a spell for creating a magical ring, where you draw Helios, the sun god, surrounded by an Ouroboros on I think it's a heliotrope. It's a stone connected with the sun, and so on and so forth. And a couple of scholars have directly connected that to the mouth opening ritual, because they call on this divinity called Ophor, which they claim is a I guess a Hellenization of the Egyptian expression opet, which was the Egyptian word for the mouth opening ritual. Opet means to open the mouth or the eyes, which was really the crux of that rite, because you're making that statue or that substance able to perceive. You're opening its senses into this world, so that divinity can have a vehicle in this level of reality.
Another survival, and this is all you, and I adored this in your writings and in the collection you edited, is we not only have a survival of the priestly art, I think you make a very good case that at the kind of nub, nub's the wrong word, the center of the philosophical survival, if we can split them apart again just temporarily, into Hermeticism, is a survival of the Memphite theology. If you would like to discuss that, Dr. Cheak.
Yeah, that's something, it's really fascinating. There was this article by Erik Iversen, which came out in 1984, 1985. He was a Danish Egyptologist who really turned the tide around on the evaluation of Hermeticism, because he did this elaborate comparison of the Memphite cosmology of Egypt with the Corpus Hermeticum itself, and basically showed how the same theological themes are present in both texts, and often in points of details that are really hard to deny. So the basic thrust of it is that of that sort of Egyptian theology, and when you look at any Egyptian theology, they're really recasting the same ideas in different forms depending on the overarching god of the nome or city-state. But you have this Trinitarian idea of a divinity where there's a divine mind and a divine body or a manifestation, and there's a mediating principle of logos, or the creative power itself. So what generally happens in these cosmologies is that the divine mind, which is immaterial, manifests its creative power, as in the Memphite cosmology, it does this as it's the tongue of the tongue emerges first to articulate the divine logos, which is held in the divine mind, and this tongue or logos articulates like a magic spell. It brings the body of reality into being, and that body of reality is the body of the divine being, and that is the cosmos. That is, they call it in the Greek text, they call it pan, the all. So when you have alchemical formulas from the Greek text saying hen to pan, the one is all, you can really see this encapsulating this kind of cosmology where this overarching divine mind is also embodied in the universe itself, the visible physical universe. But what you have here is really three layers of reality, like the divine mediating reality, and then the physical level of being, which which correlates quite well, I think, with what you get in Ficino and Agrippa, with the divineness, the celestial and the natural. And certainly this kind of trinity, or this threefold understanding of reality as different aspects of one divine being, is most it directly flows into the Hermetic corpus.
So here's a question for you then. I don't expect a lot of people knew that at the time. I think that was like full-blown secret wisdom. I think you had to have been a zookeeper in Memphis for a long time before you had that wisdom imparted to you. So this is an opinion question rather than an evidence-based one. Has the Corpus Hermeticum spilled the beans? Is it a survival of like initiatory? In this case, like, is it a survival of a piece of initiatory wisdom that, now that as the temples are in decline, it's like, fuck it, let's let's put it in here, so at least that understanding remains, because it seems to me like it's stuff you don't just sort of shout in the agora in Alexandria.
Yeah, I think it's implicit, but not explicit. It's there, but it takes some of your own. It takes something personal on your own path and your own exploration of these traditions to before you can really synthesize that and extract that essence. And this is also symptomatic of these traditions themselves too, because even though all these things were part of an integral whole, not everyone was initiated or had the experience to know all the parts of that whole. So in a sense, the alchemists were kind of separate, because they were making the materials for the statues, for instance, and then the priests would perhaps animate them, and maybe the astrologers would choose the timing for that animation, and so that you can sort of understand that people would specialize, as it were, in the different kind of facets of this one divine art, for someone to have that holistic grasp of all those parts would that's something that require that's probably less likely to be explicit in the texts.
All right, so speaking of text, let's close out with another opinion question and some recommendations. In your opinion, do you think I'm quite glass half full about this, do you think we're looking at the possibility in the short term of a bit of a golden age in esoteric research? That's question one. Question two, for people who are interested, I mean, I have a very... practical's the wrong word, a very down and dirty book recommendation system, which is, as you just saw, like Alchemy's a great book and it's fascinating, and then you throw in John Anthony West and it muddies it a bit, but it's kind of this down and dirty way of getting people up to speed fairly quickly. You, however, have a PhD in these areas, so are we looking at a new golden age? And for people who are, I would say everyone listening, are fascinated and want to know more about this stuff, what is your top 5 books, maybe even in sequence, if you know that you want to say, okay, well, cool, if you're interested in this, here's how you do a DIY crash course in the history and significance of Hermeticism?
Right. Yeah, that's they're good questions. In terms of the golden age, are we in or entering a new golden age of esotericism? I don't know. I do have a very soft spot for people like René Guénon and Julius Evola, who take the opposite view, that no, we're really deep in the thick of the Kali Yuga. We're deep in the age of decline. But at the same time, depending on how you kind of fathom that the timeline of that whole process, I don't know. It's like Dante, when Dante descends to the nadir of hell. It's like when you get that low, the only way is up,
Well, that's the thing about the Kali Yuga, isn't it? You only have to chant the mantra once because it's so dark here. So I get what you're saying, for sure.
Yeah, so I'm sympathetic. I'm optimistic more than pessimistic, but
like from a research perspective, because I think about it, I'm obviously very interested in the history of people who practice magical witchcraft, and if I think of a hypothetical cunning man in Cornwall in the 1600s, his mouth would water at the range of information that is available to us today, and the growing level of analysis that is more than competent that's showing up. And that's kind of what I meant, like from an esoteric research perspective. Crowley must be turning in his grave to think of the stuff that we have access to now. And these poor Golden Dawn kids were, knocking about in the British Museum with Budge's translations of stuff. And here we are, talking about it now. And for me, that's what I meant. Do you think this is, I don't want to mean like a renaissance, but do you think we're looking at a golden age of esoteric research?
In terms of research, I mean, it's phenomenal. I mean, even just going back to when I was in my late teens and early 20s and what I had access to before the internet versus now. I mean, in that sense, we have a phenomenal access to information. I mean, I love now how you can, if I can go onto like Swiss library websites and get the original edition of Carl Jung's copy of the Rosarium Philosophorum, and it's got Jung's bookplate in the beginning, and it like scans page by page. It's the original text, that sort of thing is really amazing. And also, what I really value myself, I mean, being, as we were saying at the beginning, to some degree disconnected from a lot of things that I'm drawn to, is the way that I can connect to like-minded people in this day and age, which would have been probably much harder to do in different times, So I kind of cobbled together my alliances and friendships across, different continents because just by nature, really, I sort of can't get along with normal people. So
find the others, baby.
Yeah. So in that sense, I totally agree with you.
So book recommendos then.
Book recommendations. Well, for Hermeticism and Alchemy and things of that ilk, I do think that book Alchemy by Van den Broek is a great place to start. It's probably it's quite deep. It throws you in the deep end, but it's really a great introduction to some very deep aspects of alchemy on a laboratory level, but also on a I guess initiatory or personal level, and also kind of opens you up to Schwaller's life and work like you would otherwise never see it before. So that's certainly a starting point for the things that certainly within my purview that I like to kind of explore. For Hermeticism, I would probably, I'm not even sure how available this is, but that text by Iverson it's called Egyptian and Hermetic Doctrine, is really, it's a fantastic hit of genuine Egyptian theology and a really close interface with Hermeticism. My own book on alchemy, I hesitate to
we were going to do the book thing at the end, but definitely put it on this list.
Well, I hesitate to recommend it because it's a big, dense beast. It's not an introductory text as such, but what it does do, it brings you get a nice hit of Egyptian alchemy and Hellenistic and Greek alchemy as well as and the Western alchemical traditions. But you also get, I also brought on people like David Gordon White, who was one of the leading authorities on Hindu tantric alchemy. And I've got a guy, probably, I don't know anyone else writing on this material, but he wrote a brilliant chapter on Tibetan alchemy, which is just, there's almost next to nothing of good quality about this that I know of. And
do you have a favorite translation of the Corpus Hermeticum that's widely available? Do you go Salomon? Do you go who do you go with?
There's the Copenhagen one's not too bad. There's an edition called The Way of Hermes.
That's Clement Salomon, isn't it?
Clement Salomon, yeah.
That's my favorite.
I do like that one because it's got the Hermetic definitions in it as well. So yeah, that's a good translation. If you want the Greek, you have to go to the Scott edition, which is, unless you want the Festugian edition, which is got a French translation. But yeah, going for the Greek and Latin is kind of probably only for specialists. No, I have trouble because I engage this material not so much at the introductory book level, and so I'm a little bit out of touch with what starting points to give people for some of this material. I mean, I would highly recommend Gregory Shaw's book, Theurgy in the Soul.
Yeah, that's seconded. That's a great book.
That is a fantastic book for understanding what we were speaking about before, about how philosophy was a much richer thing, and it was much more, locked into this process of incarnating the divine forces. And also I really love Peter Kingsley's work. I would recommend either his first book, Ancient Philosophy, Mystery Magic, which is about Empedocles and the Pythagorean tradition, but it really explores so much about alchemy and the magical papyri and Hermeticism and all these kind of things, showing how they grow out of this original concept of philosophy. His first book, which is published through Oxford, is fantastic. It's much more academic. His other book is just called Reality.
See, I find that too whimsical. It's got this faux whimsy in it, like he's trying to be. Yeah, I agree with your first Kingsley recommendation, but I struggled. I struggle with Reality. I
like it, actually. I do like that book.
I found the pacing of it too whimsy, like faux whimsy. Yeah. Like, look at me trying, not like he was showing off, but the pace of it was too, trying to be mystically.
A number of people have had that same problem with it, and I get that. I don't have that problem with it myself, so I'd happily recommend it. But if you want, if you want to avoid anything that approaches that, go to his first book.
Absolutely. I mean, don't get me wrong, he's great, but that book didn't endear itself to me as much as his other ones.
Yeah. So I've recommended.
You got your book. We got the Salomon translation. We've got Alchemy. We have something by Peter Kingsley. If people like Reality, I mean, that kind of not like yourself because I don't have a PhD, but I'm a little bit beyond the spoon feeding pace of Reality. But if people aren't, if they're new, it's a great book.
Yeah. So a fifth book to recommend. I don't know, I'm just going to take a stab. This is not really deeply considered in terms of how it fits with the rest, but there's a great small little volume it's a translation of Zosimos of Panopolis, and it's called On the Letter Omega.
Excellent choice.
Yeah, and it's a small little book, and it's still in print. I just actually got my own copy of it recently. And the translator, oh my God, I've forgotten his name. I was told by, I think, Roy Kotansky, who was one of the translators of the Betz edition of the Greek magical papyri, and he's done a lot of work on magical lamellae and so forth, told me some really fascinating stories about the translator who apparently was a savant and was absolutely brilliant, but he tragically killed himself and his partner at the time. So there's this really kind of fascinating, tragic story behind the translator.
I think that's quite considered, even if it's unconsciously considered, because with Zosimos you get how this stuff spreads. You get an indication of how this stuff spread out into the wider classical world, and from there, if you're familiar with at least one or two grimoires, you actually can start to see Oh, there's quite a bit of overlap here in terms of correspondences and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and what's good about that, and it's a really short text. Zosimus is, for me, it's kind of a hidden key to you bringing a lot of these traditions we've been speaking about together, because he does reference these, these alchemical gilding techniques which were used on statues, and these would have been used on statues that would have been animated in a temple context. And he was actually involved in the temple of Memphis, I think it was.
Well, you can tell that when he stops, when there are things he's like, and I can't talk about that. There are bits in his writing, and he's a hidden key because he was told to be the hidden key. He's like, he was told to pull this stuff together.
Yeah, and it's I had this personal revelation recently about Zosimus and this idea of being a key. In French, the word for key is clé. Right, clay means key in French, and in Zosimus, he talks about he talks about Adam. In the Hebrew word, Adam means clay, as in the mineral, the substance, clay, the earthly substance, and being a body or a body for the man of light. And he talks about how this man or being of light is kind of trapped in this body of clay, and this whole motif sparks a whole lot of important lines of research, which can take you as far afield as Mahayana Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism, and so forth. The idea of Buddha nature being primordial and eternal within the material body. But importantly, it highlights the spiritual aspect of ancient alchemy, because most of the alchemical texts that we do have from that period are very much recipes. Take the water of sulfur, divine sulfur, and mix it with orpiment, or it's very much mineralogical and metallurgical recipes, and one wonders where does the spiritual stuff come in? But Zosimus gives you really the keys to both.
That's fantastic. And so we got a book list, brilliant. And Aaron, for people who'd like to know more about yourself, where might they go to find out more?
Okay, you can go to my website, which is just www.aaroncheak.com. And I've also, that's probably the best place to go, and from there you can be directed or misdirected elsewhere.
Nice, yeah, and that'll be in the show notes along with the book and so on. So, well, I have loved this. I love a good Egypt talk. Thank you very much, sir. It has been a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise. No, thank you.
Aaron Cheak, ladies and gentlemen, talking Hermeticism and magical Egypt. Be sure to check out his site, his book, and his book recommendations. If pestering people with PhDs for free book advice is your jam, and I think we all know it is, then subscribe to the show in iTunes, Pocket Cast, Stitcher, or on YouTube. Join in the conversation at runesoup.com, the RuneSoup Facebook page, or find me on Twitter where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.